probably for the first 10 years after coming out, nearly every phone call with my mother resulted in her crying. And the sort of constant refrain of sort of like, why would you do this to me? It was always about like me doing something to her. And I think I carried a lot of guilt for that.
Welcome back to Matt and Lucy Mind the Gap. This is another installment of our special series, Pride and Healing Hearts, where we shine a light on stories from the LGBTQIA+ community. I'm Matt, pronouns she, her, and I'm thrilled to explore the powerful themes of love, identity, and resilience with all of you today.
And I'm Lucy, pronouns she, her. In this series, we've been diving into the journeys of individuals in the queer community, people who have faced the challenges of coming out, navigating family dynamics, and finding healing through their truth. It's been such an inspiring exploration, and today's episode is no different.
We're beyond excited to welcome very special guest, April Hennessey. April has an incredible story to share about navigating identity, cultural expectations, and the journey towards self-acceptance. April, it truly is an honor to have you here with us.
I'm so excited to be here with you all. So thanks for having me.
So, April, we know that coming out is such a deeply personal experience, but it's also shaped by the family and cultural context that we grow up in, right? So can you share a bit about your own coming out journey and how your upbringing kind of influenced that process?
Sure. Yeah. So I was raised in a home where I had several sort of big barriers to coming out. I think I was raised in a home that was a military household. So my dad was a career military guy. I was raised in a home with a mother who was Korean. And so there was a big cultural barrier. And then also raised in a home that was deeply, deeply religious from a sort of fundamentalist perspective. And so, again, another huge barrier, as you might imagine. And I didn't really know, like some people would say, like I knew early on, and maybe I sort of did. I didn't have language for what I felt or what I thought, I would get these sort of like crushes on my friends and things like that, but I didn't recognize them as crushes. I always felt like maybe in certain instances with certain people, I felt more strongly about them than they felt about me, but I would never have characterized it as like a crush, right? So I didn't really know early on. But I sort of, as I was developing in sort of high school and things like that, began to sense that maybe I was different a little bit, and that maybe some of those feelings I had were not just friendship related, but maybe moving into other territory. I came out when I was 19, I guess. So after high school, in my first year of college, my parents had very strongly insisted that I attend a Christian college for my first year. And the longer I was there, the more I began to recognize that it wasn't going to be a place for me long term. And part of that was because I had begun to truly recognize my sexuality, and that I was gay. And so I knew that I wasn't going to be able to stay there for long. And it started the process for me of coming out and moving into this space where I would begin to explore what it looked like to live as a gay person in the early 2000s or in the late 90s. So yeah, that was kind of like the beginning of my story.
Thank you for sharing that.
So, April, in your 2013 blog post, Someone Else's Closet, and I love that title, you reflect on the emotional toll of navigating your mother's struggles with your identity. How did managing that family dynamic or those dynamics shape your understanding of love, acceptance, and self-worth?
It's a great question. I think for me, especially, you know, having a mother who was Korean, I was raised in this things are just very different in Korean culture, right? The way in which children are supposed to honor their parents and how their lives are supposed to be directed toward truly serving their parents and making them proud in particular ways is, I think, really heightened in Korean culture in a variety of ways. And you will see in Korean culture too that families stay connected in lots of ways beyond, when they go to college or graduate from high school, just in ways that we don't typically see here in the US, right? So families living in the same household for long periods of time, well beyond the time when they are sometimes married. So families living together, lots of generations in one household. And so there is this kind of expectation on children, and especially being the oldest of three, and the eldest daughter, there were certain expectations for me about what my role would be in caring for my parents and caring for my family. And when I came out, all of that was disrupted because of the religious aspects, because of the cultural aspects. There was a big rift or rupture for my family. And probably for the first 10 years after coming out, nearly every phone call with my mother resulted in her crying. And the sort of constant refrain of sort of like, why would you do this to me? It was always about like me doing something to her. And I think I carried a lot of guilt for that, because nobody wants to feel like they're harming their parents or people they love in any way. And I wanted to be able to fulfill my responsibility as the eldest daughter. And yet, because of who I was, because of this sort of fundamental thing about me, from my mother's perspective, I was not going to be capable of fulfilling that for her. And so it really did, I think, for a long time, impact the way that I saw myself, the way that I saw myself fulfilling that particular role for her, and just so much guilt and so much shame. And then beyond that, from the religious perspective, there was this fear still embedded in me that had literally been beaten into me as a child, right? That I was straying from this particular path, which I had been raised to believe was the only path. And I kid you not, I probably lived in fear of getting struck by lightning until like I was 30 years old or something, right? So it seems like such a silly thing. Like, of course, you're not going to be struck by lightning just for being gay. But that was the kind of messaging that I'd received as a child. And so some part of me still held on to that and believed that. So lots of things that I had to unpack and untangle.
Well, it's definitely a theme. I think that we've heard, among our guests, right, Lucy, but also that I've just heard from so many people. And I've met you, April. We've worked together, so I know you a little bit. And my sense of you is that you're responsible, that you care about people, and that you'd rather stab yourself with a fork than disappoint someone.
Yes.
Right? So that whole early adulthood where your whole experience is, to be who I am means that I'm disappointing the people I love. Mm-hmm. I'm disappointing God.
Yep.
It just sounds hard.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Going back to that blog post in someone else's closet, you also shared how the Supreme Court's 2013 decision to strike down DOMA was a pivotal moment in your life as a queer person. And since then, there have been, significant milestones like marriage and equality in 2015 and the Respect for Marriage Act, but also this rise in legislation that's targeting trans and LGBTQIA plus rights. So I'm wondering, like, for someone today who might feel unable to come out, especially as trans, like, how do you see your experience resonating with their struggles? And what message would you share with them about finding hope or navigating this moment?
So coming out in the 90s was still quite a scary thing. We weren't far from, all of the AIDS crisis, we have Matthew Shepard, we have all of these other things that we're sort of still thinking about and grappling with into the 2000s. And I was with my partner for well over a decade at that point in 2013. We had a kid together. And the number of hoops that we'd had to jump through in order to protect ourselves, right? So if one of us were to be sick or to pass away or to be in the hospital so that we could have access to that person, there's so many more things that we had to put in place than your sort of everyday heterosexual married couple had to put in place. For our son, we had to go through second parent adoption so that my partner could actually have parental rights to him. And it's a sort of demoralizing thing to have to experience because you have to have home visits. You have to fill out these papers. Like I had to fill out this questionnaire about like what my discipline practices would be and how I would enact these sorts of things and who would, and you know, they're just things that like people don't have to do or don't have to think about if they aren't, you know, LGBTQ plus, or they've had a child in a more sort of traditional way. And so that sort of legalizing of our union and our ability to have rights and not have to argue for healthcare, like this person is my partner, my life partner, no, not my business partner, you know, like to not have to jump through those hoops in that way was such a relief. And it felt like for once, you know, it was a step towards legitimizing what we already knew was legitimate, but not always from the world's perspective had already been legitimized, right? So, you know, I think it's so interesting because we see these moments where progress fluctuates, moves forward, it moves backwards, it moves forwards, it moves backwards. And we've been in this push and pull for such a long time. But the thing that if I take a sort of step back and look historically, we have made progress, right? Like we have moved the needle on equity and sort of finding justice for these things. And you can't take it all away. You can't move it all back, right? You can't begin to strip rights away from everyone and like roll the clock back. We don't have, you know, like a time machine. It's not possible. Even in places like Korea, just last year, passed legislation that same-sex couples in Korea now had access to health benefits. The world is moving forward. Whether or not things in the US at this moment are sort of trailing backwards again. And so a couple of things. One, for those individuals out there who still or now have new fear again about coming out, there are always safe places to be found. There always have been forever and ever and ever. So find those places that are safe. Find those people who are going to protect you, who are going to stand up for your rights, who are going to advocate for you, and who can just be soft places to land, right? Because I had those people as a 20-something-year-old with no communication or support from my parents, trying to figure out how to be a person, right? And how to go to college and how to pay my rent and how to get health insurance. And on top of all of those things, like just trying to figure out like, how do I make peace with who I am when other people are telling me that I'm something wrong? So finding the places that are soft places and that are safe places, I think is a great start, because those are the places where you begin to build up that self-worth and the courage to sort of speak up and say, this is who I am, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm here for, and to lean into that. And I think that we find hope in those places too. If I look at the world and I just sort of look at everything on fire, it's easy to feel despair. You know, it's impossible not to feel despair. But I look at the work of people out there, like the Reverend just the other day in that inauguration service, calling for compassion for trans people. Like that was the moment for mercy, compassion. That was a moment for me where I just felt like 20 years ago, we would never have had a person speaking like this from a public pulpit ever. That's progress. That gives me hope. That reminds me that we're moving forward still, even when it looks like we're moving backward. So look for those moments of hope and the people where you can sort of be in that hope with.
Very well said.
Well, speaking of advice for others. We'd love to hear if there was a specific turning point in your journey, whether it was family reconciliation or societal shifts or personal growth, where you felt like there was a change in how you saw yourself and your relationships. And can you share a moment like that?
I think these things are so gradual. Sometimes we don't recognize they're happening. I mean, I had a turning point with my mom, for instance, when I was pregnant, and I just said, you have to get on board. If you want access to this child, you have to accept us as we are, all of us. You can't pick and choose. I'm not going to bring this baby to you and leave my partner at home and sort of say like, okay, you can have access to us, but not this whole thing, because eventually it says to my child that there's something wrong with us, that we can't all be together in this space. So, that was a turning point for me to finally sort of hold my ground with my family and say, you accept all of us or you get none of us. And that's the line for me. And I think it gave me courage, because if you can do it in those relationships that are most fraught or most important to you, it becomes easier and easier to do it in the spaces around you. I think one of the things for me was that I just got tired. The blog post, Someone Else's Closet, came from the fact that like, even when I had come out, it was never enough. You're always coming out of someone else's closet or out of someone else's expectations, right? And so the LGBTQ plus person like never comes out a single time. We come out every day, over and over and over, in every interaction where someone says, what does your husband do? Because I don't look sort of stereotypically lesbian or whatever it is I'm supposed to look like, right? So the number of times someone have asked me, or the number of times people ask me about my husband rather than like my spouse, I couldn't even count them. I just got tired. It was just this exhaustion. And so I just lead with it. I just started leading with it at all moments and saying, my wife and I, or whatever it was, to signal that thing before we even got there so that I didn't have to come out in that way. And the other thing is that I stopped watching for people's micro expressions and worrying about what that meant. Mm-hmm. I started to put that on other people and say, it's not my responsibility how they feel about this. And I used to take that on, like, will they feel uncomfortable? Will I make it awkward? Will they be upset? Will they be angry? And I just had to abandon that and say, like, their responses are not mine. I'm just going to live in my truth, speak my truth, and move on about my day. And it was so liberating and freeing to stop looking constantly for the way that I might upset or impact or influence or whatever someone else as a result of being true to myself. And I think that's tied back to the beginning of my story too, which was so embedded in duty and responsibility and wanting to make other people happy and not wanting to upset people. And so it was a journey. It didn't happen overnight, but it was important.
And as someone who has sort of navigated that intersection of, cultural and familial expectations with your identity, I'm curious, like, what advice would you offer to those who are coming from similar cultural backgrounds, especially when dealing with values or even traditions that may conflict with who they are, as was the case for you? Like, how can they begin to honor their roots while still affirming their identity?
It's hard. It's really hard, because as I sit here and I said the thing that I just said with all that like assurance and bravado, I will tell you that when I encounter people who are Korean or people like Korean people, I still have that moment of fear, right? Mm-hmm. And of shame. And it's always my first response in those interactions, like, oh no, because it's still really fraught in that space and in that culture, right? It's getting better. We're starting to see representation in like K-drama and KTV and things like that, K-pop and other places, but it's still very, very fraught. And so I notice that especially when it comes to my own cultural sort of baggage and heritage and things like that, it's fraught. And for a long time, what it meant for me was that I stayed away from it. I almost like disavowed it. I just was like, well, it's just not, I just didn't enter into those spaces. It's probably only been within the past couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, that I've really started to own it more deeply, right? And enter into spaces where other Asian people are together, because it's important. It is an important part of who I am and how I was raised. And it felt like I had sort of cut off a piece of myself in order to not have to feel that discomfort, right? And so you have to do it in your own time and in your own way. And I think it is sometimes paradoxical. Sometimes you have to hold the paradox, like, this doesn't always fit here, and yet it's part of who I am. And so I'm going to try to hold both of these things in a space at the same time. And you see what happens, and you do it over and over again. And what I discovered is that eventually you find people like you, because I'm not the only Korean American person who is also a lesbian in the whole world. You begin to find other people like you who are wading into those spaces, who are very much in touch with those cultural aspects of their identity and also want to be true to who they are. You figure it out a little at a time. And then sometimes you discover that the spaces you create are a little bit different than maybe what they looked like at one point for my mother, or as a kid growing up in those Korean cultural spaces. Like, now they're a little different, and it's okay.
Well, April, your reflections on culture, identity, and family have brought such a unique and powerful perspective to this conversation. And your story and advice will undoubtedly resonate with listeners who are navigating these intersections in their own lives. So thank you so much, sincerely, for sharing it with us.
Yeah, it was really nice to be here with you all and just to reflect on some of those things. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that whole sort of journey that often in that way.
Well, I think it's valuable for our listeners to get that kind of step back perspective, no matter where they are, right? So to our listeners, if April's story has struck a chord with you, and if you're finding it difficult to navigate family or cultural challenges, know that you're not alone, and that there are communities and resources out there that can provide support.
For anyone who is looking for resources or support, please don't hesitate to explore spaces that affirm and celebrate your journey. And find us, Matt and Lucy Mind the Gap, on Leadify, Spotify, and YouTube channels, as well as other social media platforms.
So thanks again, April, for joining us today and sharing your story with such openness and such courage, which is, of course, we know it's a hallmark of you. Beautiful thing. And to our listeners, until next time, continue celebrating your truth, supporting one another, and minding the gap.